Alright, in this video we're going to take a look at Chapter 8, America Secedes from the Empires. Kind of the early first couple of years of the war and the Declaration of Independence in this section. Congress drafts Washington. So after Lexington and Concord in April of 75, Congress decides that was a pretty big deal and it's time to have another meeting. And so they have a meeting again in Philadelphia between May and June of 75. And they get a lot done, a lot more than they got done in the first Congress. And so in the second Congress, they recognized that the 20,000 militiamen that were surrounding Boston, that is the Continental Army, and they're hoping to expand that with volunteers from other countries or other states as well. And so they recognize these Minutemen as the official U.S. Army for the first time. They decide to put George Washington in charge as the commander of this new army for a couple reasons. One, he's showing up in uniform. He's the tallest guy in the room. That was one of the jokes that they would tell. But the big reasons as far as why they chose him, one, he had military experience from the French and Indian War, a lot more experience than most of the other guys did. He had a lot of strong leadership qualities. People liked him. He was trustworthy. But the other reasons, the more political reasons, would be that, one, he's wealthy. He was one of the richest men in America at the time. And so he wouldn't be just in it for the money. He's not doing it just for the money. And so he's not going to just try to steal things along the way. And the other thing is that as a Southerner, specifically as a Virginian from the largest state, this would help to balance things out. Instead of just a Northern army led by a Northerner, we have a Northern army united by a Southerner. So it's going to help to balance things out so that we become a more united States of America. We start to print out money to pay our troops, which becomes a huge mistake, especially when we print out too much money and we get a nasty bit of inflation when we start out our economy. And we also send a list of complaints to Parliament, but we're not calling for independence at this point. We're hoping that if we fight anymore, they will give in to our demands and we can go back to just kind of the way things were, where we have our own government and we have our own king, and we can kind of work together. And so it's a bit of home rule will probably satisfy us, where we can have our own government, but not have to listen to Parliament, and we can tax ourselves, but not be ruled by Parliament. We'd be fine with that. Bunker Hill and the Hessians. So after Lexington and Concord, the colonial militia chase the British back to Boston, and they surround them, and the British are kind of stuck there for the next year or so. In the meantime, while they're stuck there are plenty of other forts to attack. So Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen, two of the top generals, they're going to go to a fort that's not really well defended, Fort Ticonderoga, out in the frontier, to capture things that we just don't have. We are low on gunpowder and we don't have any cannons. We just don't have the ability to make our own cannons. And so we have to go and steal the British cannons. And so they're able to capture the fort. The tricky part is getting those cannons all the way back to Boston, especially in the middle of winter. And plus, we're going to have to, these are pretty heavy cannons, and in some cases we're going to have to cross frozen rivers to get there. So we have to come up with some type of engineering to transport these cannons, but Henry Knox is up to the job. And we get the cannons over to Boston eventually, but in the meantime we have Bunker Hill. This is the nastiest battle in the war. It's pretty early in the war, and it's the deadliest battle in the whole thing. And in the middle of the night, troops set up, American troops set up and take over Bunker Hill, although it was actually Breed's Hill, which is the next hill over. It was confused as Bunker Hill, but the Battle of Bunker Hill is what it's called, even though it was actually Breed's Hill. And so, Battle of Bunker Hill, June of 75, and I think of that hot summer and all this wool, not comfortable. 2,400 British troops march up a Boston Hill right next to Boston to engage the colonists who are on top of the hill. And they fired, and the Americans kept on firing. Eventually they started to run out of gunpowder, and so the big command became, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes from the top of the hill. Just because they had so few bullets, they're running out of bullets, they wanted to conserve their bullets. And it's a clear victory for the Americans, just because they had that uphill advantage. And so you just imagine trying to march up the hill while being shot at. Plus, the British don't see what's on the other side of the hill. So they can't anticipate, they don't know what to do. And if there's artillery lobbing cannonballs down the hill, it's not a clear advantage, and they have to walk slowly while being shot at. And so with all these advantages, the Americans do very well, but unfortunately they are outnumbered and outgunned. And so they do lose the battlefield, and they technically lose the battle in that case, and that they do have to retreat, and they lose the territory. However, in the meantime, out of those 2,400 Brits that marched up the hill, 1,000 would die on the way. So it's very heavy casualties on the English side. Only 450 colonists died, and so it's a pretty big win for us. The UK gains the territory, but the US gains a big moral victory, and that in this case, this was more of a clear battle as opposed to Lexington and Concord. This was more like a real battle, and we did pretty well. It's the deadliest battle in the entire war, and a major turning point. But we still are not for independence. We still say we're still going to send a letter to the king. So the Second Continental Congress sends another letter called the Olive Branch Petition, the olive branch being a symbol of peace. And so under the Olive Branch Petition, we're just asking the king, okay, we're kind of done fighting. Will you give in to our demands? Can we get along now? And the king says no. This was not addressed to Parliament, and that's a really important fact that we're not even talking about Parliament because we don't recognize Parliament's ability to rule over us. We do talk to the king, we're fine with the king, but we see Parliament as a separate government, we're fine, we have our own government. The king refuses after this battle, he says it's on, declares that the colonies are an open rebellion, that this Congress is committing an act of treason, and they will all be executed. And in the meantime, he also hires a German army, the Hessian mercenaries, to add to his own troops. And so this is mostly written by John Dickinson, who fought really hard to hold the colonies together, but it didn't work out. And there's the king. In the meantime, we try to invade Canada. We figure if we take Canada, we can get a couple things. So this is right after Bunker Hill. We decide, all right, the next step, let's go for Canada. This is the chance to add a 14th colony. We could have one continuous, giant America. However, this does go kind of against the big idea here, in that this is a defensive war. We're trying to go for independence. Instead, we're going on offense and attacking Canada. The attack does not work out at all. After a long march through the woods, from September all the way to December, it starts to get cold. We're marching through the woods of Maine all the way up through Quebec. And so after this long march, we're not feeling too great. The top general, General Montgomery, is killed on the field. Here's a little painting of him being killed on the field. And the second in command, General Arnold, is shot in the legs. So one guy's dead, the other guy is taken out of commission. And so with our top generals out of the way, we don't do too well. We are able to take Montreal, but not Quebec. If we could have gotten Quebec, this would have changed the war significantly, and Canada would not exist. It would just be another state. However, although the citizens of Canada really were not welcoming to us, they didn't want to be ruled by the Americans because the Americans were so anti-Catholic, and were just pretty angry about the Quebec Act, still had animosity over the French and Indian War. So the Canadians, we make jokes, but they're pretty tough, and they kicked us out here. Common Sense. Written by Thomas Paine, and so he's an Englishman, comes over, and becomes one of our strongest Americans. And he writes a short pamphlet. It's only 36 pages or so. And in this pamphlet, he sets up a solid argument about why we should be independent and set up a republic. He attacks the king. He attacks all the problems of Parliament and says it's time. And it's quite convincing, especially after the problems of Bunker Hill, especially after the king hires Germans to attack his own people. This sells very, very well. 500,000 copies, extremely popular, with a population of 2.5 million. 1 in 5 people have this, and a lot of people are borrowing this, reading it here and there. So everyone's reading this thing, and it hits a lot of the philosophical points that we're thinking about at this point, and what our government should look like. And some even start to favor a natural aristocracy, not a biological aristocracy in that it should be passed from father to son. We don't believe in that anymore. It should be based on talent. Who is talented? And if you're talented, you're going to be a natural-born leader, and you're welcome in this government. But you shouldn't get the government just because your dad was king. So let's move forward to independence now. With these battles and this argument put forth, we start to move forward. So first, it has to come from a Virginian to declare independence. Richard Henry Lee from Virginia, because they are the biggest state, and especially because we don't want this just to be a northern thing about Boston. It's got to be all the states. And so Richard Henry Lee says, okay, let's take a vote for independence. Okay, 1 month later, everybody goes back to their individual states to say, hey, do we want independence? They ask permission from their individual states. Each state says, let's go forward, let's do this. At that point, Congress says, okay, each state should create their own state governments, and let's start fresh. And so in this month, while they're asking permission from their individual governments whether or not they should declare independence, as they're creating their new state constitutions, they decide, okay, if we do declare independence, when we meet again, in July, when we meet again, we need to have a little declaration to kind of give the king a few reasons as far as why we're going to declare independence. So they decide, all right, let's go with Jefferson. And they do set up a larger committee. It's not just Jefferson, it's several other men to kind of go through the draft. The big guys are going to be Franklin, Adams, Roger Livingston, and one that I'm forgetting. But in the end, it's mostly Jefferson's hand, just with a few adjustments here and there. So they come back, and as he's writing this, he is heavily influenced by the philosophy of Locke, and we've looked at him a little bit already. Ideas such as people have the right to, and people are born with the right to, they're not given by the king, but born with, the right to live life, liberty, and properly, and that nobody can take your life away, nobody can take your freedom away, nobody should be able to take your property away. Later on, we decided to change this property aspect to the pursuit of happiness, and that's kind of a bigger picture that it can include property. This is the idea of republicanism, the idea that the whole government is only allowed to exist as long as the people want it to exist. People consent to obey a government that protects rights. So I give up a little bit of my freedom to the government. In exchange, the government protects those freedoms and my right to life, liberty, and property. However, if this government's not working for me, if it's not protecting my life, liberty, and property, it's time for revolution. And so people can resist or overthrow a government that denies their basic rights. Another big idea he puts forward is all men are created equal. A lot of controversy over that statement, especially as far as what did he mean, and we still debate that. But most historians agree as far as what he meant at the time was that all free citizens are politically equal, so that all voters should be treated the same. That means my vote is the same as Barack Obama's vote, is the same as Donald Trump's vote. Just because someone is rich or powerful doesn't mean they get more votes. So this one's tricky. It's not necessarily about race or anything else when it talks about all men are created equal. It's more about political equality, and that the king doesn't get more power than the average citizen. Everyone's the same. So after this argument, after creating this document, they come back to Congress for the vote. July 2nd, they take a vote and they declare, we're independent. So it's actually July 2nd is our Independence Day. We declare independence on that day. After July 2nd that we declare independence, we decide, okay, we got to tell the people what just happened, and we have to tell the king what just happened. So let's go through the Declaration. So the Declaration is presented, and we go through it word by word with the entire Congress. So Congress has to change a few things here and there. Originally, one of Jefferson's ideas was to blame all of slavery on the king, and he had a whole thing on the evils of slavery, but most of the slave states said, yeah, let's cut that out. And so they cut a few things out of the Declaration. By July 4th, they had the whole thing ready to go. And so they had, with their Declaration ready, they declare, right, and they adopt it. The whole reason we declare independent, or we have Independence Day on July 4th, mostly is because that's the day that citizens actually knew we are independent. And it's right on the document, it says July 4th. And so, yeah, it's a little difference between Independence Day and when we actually said, this is the Declaration, this is the thing we want to say. This is the announcement. Now that we're independent, it's time for war, and everybody's got to pick a side. And it's a time for choosing sides. And so on the Loyalist or Tory side, Tory is the political party that's closer to the king. These are colonists who oppose independence, and they're still loyal to England. A lot of these people will still work in colonial government, such as Benjamin Franklin's son, was the governor of New Jersey, so he had a good job already. Anybody that had a job working for the king, to keep that job, they're going to stay loyal. They trust the crown to protect their basic rights, and they think a lot of people are going overboard on this thing. Although they are a small minority, only 16, maximum 20% of Americans were loyalists. Very strong in the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania to an extent, but also in the Anglican Church in the South, in the Deep South, because the head of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, is the King of England, so they've been taught to obey the King of England in their churches. That's not something easy to throw away. A lot of other loyalists would include recent immigrants from the UK, people that just moved over, still loyal to the king, weren't expecting all this revolution. We also get country farmers, people that were poor farmers who weren't too happy with the rich farmers, guys like Washington and Jefferson, who they thought had too much power. We also get the very, very rich, the aristocrats, who became rich because of the king, and so some of the big port cities that had a lot of rich people, including New York City and Charleston, South Carolina, a lot of loyalist activity there. Another major component as far as the loyalists would include runaway slaves, because this is their chance for freedom, but also Native Americans. Native Americans, especially with the Proclamation of 1763, they saw a better future with the British than the Americans. The Americans were going to come and take the land, so they're going to go with the British. On the, and kind of going back, two main guys here, as again, I talked about Benjamin Franklin's son. His own son was a loyalist, and eventually they have a huge fight. William Franklin here is arrested and eventually moves to England. And then down here, one of our top generals in the early years of the war, Benedict Arnold, eventually does switch sides and gives away a lot of our secrets, and so he's seen as this big American traitor, and eventually does move to England. On the American patriotic side, we have the Patriots, or the Whigs, that's the political party that's against the king, and these economists that support independence. They think, for the most part, they're going to have more economic opportunity, that they are limited by mercantilism. This is about half of Americans, so it is the majority. Very strong in the north around New England, because their religion is already not the religion of the king, especially with the Congregational Church, and especially as a trading hub, especially around Boston. And so we'll stop there as kind of the early, just couple first years of the war.